One of the robust programs of the Reserve Officer Association is our ongoing defense education forums, which are capably led by Robert Fiedler. We are presenting upwards of 70 of these defense education forums per year, mostly in the National Capital Region and most in our Minuteman building. And we're bringing together the great minds, researchers, and policymakers in the think tanks of Washington, D.C. and the nation, in our legislative branch, the executive branch, and the defense establishment. One of our frequent faculty presenters and one of the most respected, most quoted analysts of national defense is Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow of the Brookings Institute. He shares with Director General Petraeus a PhD from Princeton in Public and International Affairs. As Senior Fellow in the Foreign Policy of the Brookings Institution, he specializes in defense strategy, the use of military force, homeland security, and American foreign policy. He's a visiting lecturer at Princeton, an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins, and a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I present to you Michael O'Hanlon. There he is.
We're looking on the other side. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you. It's a little humbling to be following General Petraeus and Administrator Bolin, who have deployed to places like Afghanistan and Iraq and space, and I usually deploy to the library. But I appreciate your willingness to put up with me, and I will try to be brief and pithy and then try to get a little conversation going because we've got a number of big subjects, and I'm also honored to be speaking just before my good friend Michelle Flournoy, who I know will give a very important speech today as the administration unveils a very important new defense strategy and budget, and that's where I want to go in my remarks, is straight to that topic, with a generally supportive word about where the administration is going, but with a few questions and concerns, and in the interest of conversation, I'm going to focus on the latter. First, let me also, though, say how much of an honor it is to be with you. And I know we have leaders from yesterday, today, and tomorrow in this group who are so interested in our national security, who do so much for it, who sacrifice so much for it. And as a civilian, I can only, again, humbly say how much I appreciate and admire what you do for our nation. So thank you for that great privilege. Let me now talk a little bit about where we stand with the defense budget. And the thrust of my comments is that I think the administration is generally on the right track in looking for defense savings in the range of $400 billion to $500 billion over a decade. And just for those who are not following this debate in quite as much excruciating detail as some of us who live inside the Beltway, let me remind you that those reductions are in addition to the major savings expected as we are drawing down our forces from the wars. Of course, we're essentially out of Iraq, and we are beginning the downsizing in Afghanistan. That will be a slow process, and I think there's a good chance we'll keep 10,000 to 20,000 U.S. forces in Afghanistan even after 2014. But in any event, the drawdown has begun, and we're down to about 90,000 U.S. troops after being at 100,000 last year, and we are down to virtually zero in Iraq after being as high as 170,000. So we're getting savings from all that, and in addition, we're looking at close to $500 billion in savings as a result of the administration's new budget, which actually is really a result of law that the Congress drove because last August's Budget Control Act required as a down payment on deficit reduction that we have cuts of that magnitude. Now, as you know, and we may get to this in discussion, the possibility of sequestration could double those cuts, could add another $500 billion to the existing plan for reductions. And in fact, current law requires it. Sequestration, meaning sort of an automatic cut in the defense spending levels, is already the law of the land. It sort of happened accidentally, or I should say inadvertently, not in a desired fashion, but it is currently the law of the land, and therefore we have to worry, for those of us who think it goes too far, that it may still happen. The administration's budget and strategy that's being unveiled right now does not, however, presume sequestration. So there's a little bit of an oxymoron in a sense. The administration and the president signed a law which now, as the result of the failure of last fall's supercommittee, mandate sequestration, and yet the administration is not planning on that sequestration as a matter of current policy or as a matter of its current budget submission to the Congress that comes forth next month. It's a little confusing for those of you who aren't following it in detail, but it's worth pointing out that we're living in an ambiguous world. We don't really know where things are headed. What I want to do briefly today is explain why I think the initial cuts, the 400 to 500 billion in cuts the administration is assuming and is supporting, are a good idea. Why sequestration would, however, be a bad idea. But the big thing I want to emphasize is the administration, I think, has not gone quite far enough in finding those savings. And this is the main critical point I want to make today in the spirit of provoking conversation. Maybe it can involve some of your discussion with Undersecretary Flournoy, but in any event, I think it's going to be on the minds of lawmakers and presidential candidates for the next few months. Because what the administration has done, I believe, is to essentially understate, the way all administrations do, the real cost of its current defense program. So when it calculates savings, it's doing so from a sort of an unrealistically optimistic vantage point. And therefore, we're actually not making deep enough cuts to accomplish the budget targets that are in law. What this means, if I'm right, and I've done my own independent calculations, and I don't claim to have it done perfectly accurately, but I tried to use the best I learned in those graduate school days with then Major Petraeus when we were taking courses together. And then where I went on next was the Congressional Budget Office. And I tried to show these calculations in my new book called The Wounded Giant. And what I found is that you actually have to go a little deeper and make somewhat more significant cutbacks to achieve the budget goals that are now in the Budget Control Act, even without sequestration. You might say, why bother making such a fuss about an accounting difference or an arithmetic difference? The reason is right now the nation is willing to rethink this question of defense strategy. We've got a lot of people focused on it. We should make good use of this moment. And the problem is if you make cuts sort of piecemeal after the fact, year after year after year, you wind up doing it in a somewhat less strategic way. So while I think the administration has generally done a very good job with its new thinking, there are a couple of areas that I think it might need to go further. And I just want to lay out a couple of those. I know we don't have too much time, and I want to have most of the conversation with you in the remaining 20, 25 minutes we have in this session. So let me just lay out a couple of the ideas that I actually think should be more central in administration strategy. And I'm going to finish with one that's near and dear to your hearts, which is the role of the reserve component, especially in planning for future possible ground wars. And just to tee up where I'm going to go with that, as many of you know, the administration has proposed that we no longer need to be ready for 2 simultaneous ground wars. That would be a change that has not previously been seen in 60 years of American defense policy. Ever since Korea, we have been planning for at least 2 ground wars at a time. In the Cold War, it was typically big war in Europe against the Soviet bloc, and then another war somewhere in Asia, be it Korea, China, Vietnam, maybe something else. Since the Cold War ended, we typically focused on North Korea and Iraq. North Korea remains a problem. Iraq is still a problem in other ways, but I would submit that things have changed enough in Iraq and in the broader Middle East that the administration is correct to change our basic force sizing construct from 2 simultaneous land wars to 1 plus the ability to ramp up quickly and do a holding action in a second place if need be. But I'm not sure they've gone quite far enough in how they've changed the force structure for the Army or the Marine Corps as a result. Okay, so let me do a couple other things first, though. I want to talk about the Navy to begin. And you could consider this equal opportunity or sort of equal unkindness on my part towards each service. I'm going to try to be ecumenical and broad-based. But the Navy, an amazing service, like all 4 of our military services, doing amazing things around the world. However, escaped sort of unscathed in this budget process, frankly. The aircraft carrier fleet's supposed to stay at 11. The only changes to Navy shipbuilding programs are pretty much just some delays in things like submarine building. Nothing major in terms of any program being fundamentally rethought. And I'm a little worried that this is not really being provocative enough. I think the Navy actually has one big idea at least that it should consider. And I know a lot of you have thought about this and can give me maybe many reasons why it's hard. And I've been talking a lot to Navy people. I understand why it's hard, but I still think the time has come for something called sea swap. What sea swap means is that two crews share a given ship on forward deployment. In other words, up until now, as you all know, and many of you have been involved one way or another in this, the Navy has always kept one crew with one ship. That crew is essentially formed at the beginning of a 2 or 3 year tour of the various sailors. It trains up in American waters, starts doing longer training missions, maybe to South America for a drug-related thing or somewhere off the coast of North America. And then finally it sets off on a 6-month deployment, typically to the Persian Gulf or the Western Pacific, or in the old days more the Mediterranean. And then it comes back so that sailors are never away from their home port more than 6 months at a time. That's the way the Navy likes to operate. Unfortunately, I think this wastes a lot of time in transit. I know sometimes the ocean transits are used for good purposes. We do exercises with allies, etc. But for the most part, it's a lot of steaming time that's fairly unproductive. And when you do the math, and this is not my Princeton math, this is the Navy's math, the Navy needs 5 or 6 ships in the fleet to keep one on station. That's not a ratio that we should be tolerating. It's not a ratio that's good enough for the fiscal times in which we live. We're deploying billion-dollar warships all over the world with this fairly inefficient way of using them. And I think it's time to stop wasting that month in transit each way, and at least for the surface combatants. I'm not proposing this for the aircraft carrier fleet with 5,000 people on a ship. That would be pretty daunting. But for the surface combatants that typically have 300 people on a ship, I think it's time that we actually start flying the crew, which is trained on one ship in U.S. waters, to meet up with the ship over in Japan or somewhere else on the other side of the world, and the crews swap. Now, you may have a small residual crew that stays on to help with the transition, but if you look at the analyses of the Navy's own think tanks, like the Center for Naval Analyses, this gives you about 35% more mission deployability per ship. That's the kind of idea we need to consider in these kind of fiscal times. Because like the title of my book says, we are a wounded giant right now. The world still needs us to be a leader. It needs us to be the leader. For all the talk of China and its impressive qualities, it cannot lead a multinational coalition or alliance system. We have 60, 65 allies in the world that like to work with us. The Chinese have basically North Korea. There's a reason for this. For all of our warts, all of our failings, we have an open political system, and we have decades of experience working with our allies. Even when they disagree with us, as they often do, they feel that they can disagree in an open, transparent way. They understand our motives, and they basically trust our intentions. I hope the Chinese will get there. I'm a big believer and a hopeful person about the Chinese trajectory as well, just like Administrator Bolin, but they're not there yet. Nobody else can help sustain the international stability that we all depend on for prosperity, for nuclear nonproliferation and other tasks, except the United States. So we're a wounded giant. We have to get better. We have to reduce our deficit. Defense needs to play a role. And we've got to seize this moment to think of clever, creative ways for the Pentagon to contribute. Another idea, and again, I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to go quickly with apologies that if I'm going too quickly for some of these ideas, you can come after me in discussion. And I'll just give you one more thought, and then the National Guard reserve component issue in the two-war capability question that I mentioned before. But let me talk a little bit about nuclear forces. Nuclear forces are still very important to American security, and I think we have to be careful about keeping our arsenal reliable, safe, dependable, and also on parity with Russia. Because while I don't think the United States and Russia are going to be adversaries, and I don't really think we need to worry too much about the details of our single integrated operational plan, our big war plan for fighting the Russians, you know, that's sort of a legacy of the Cold War. I don't think the details matter very much. I do think that we want to avoid giving Mr. Putin and any other Russian nationalists who might look to nuclear forces to revitalize their sense of a greater Russia, we want to avoid giving them any hint or any suggestion that we are somehow conceding to them this trapping of superpowerdom. I'm not suggesting we get in the Russians' face and expand NATO again and that kind of thing, but I do believe that on nuclear forces we have to be careful about not drawing down unilaterally, and we also need the arsenal to be safe and reliable. However, even if you mandate or premise those basic qualities in the nuclear arsenal, you can save a lot of money, I believe, by doing some things differently. Because I don't think it matters that much, each and every detail of our warfighting plan, of our integrated operational plan. We can be a little more relaxed about these things than we used to be. So for example, instead of sailing 14 Trident submarines with ballistic missiles on them and distributing the allowable warheads under the New START Treaty across those 14 platforms, I would reduce down to 8 ships. They have the capacity. They were designed to be able to carry enough warheads to meet our New START ceilings, even with just 8 ships, very safely. And that's an example of how I think we could save some money. And similarly, we can actually do that and also reduce the ICBM force in half. Frankly, we could have a good debate about eliminating the ICBM force. I'm not sure that we should do it, but it's the kind of debate we should be having. The Obama strategy and budget documents are a little bit careful on this issue, however. I understand why they're careful. They're responsible for the nation's security in a time of war. They're also embarking on a presidential campaign where the Republicans are already criticizing them even for these more limited cutbacks that are now being proposed. But nonetheless, it's a moment when I think we need to shake things up a little. Because if we don't get our deficit in shape, we're not going to be a great power in 10 or 20 years. We're not going to be the global dominant power in 10 or 20 years, whether we want to be or not. Now let me come back to the whole issue of the 2-war versus 1-war capability. And again, I'm talking about land wars. I do think that we need simultaneous crisis response capability for both the Persian Gulf and the Western Pacific in terms of maritime and air threats. Most of our concerns in those two regions are now centered around Iran and the Persian Gulf on the one hand, with China and the Western Pacific on the other. They are not primarily scenarios that would involve large-scale ground combat operations. So our threats have shifted in their nature a little bit from what they used to be, which is part of why I'm in favor of shifting ourselves from a 2 land war capability to a 1 land war capability. However, if you're going to do that 1 land war, I admit that you've got to be pretty darn careful to make sure you have more than enough capability to do it right, because you can no longer rely on the second package for the second hypothetical war to beef up your first mission if things go wrong. So you better give yourself an added margin of insurance. You also better assume that you're going to be involved in some smaller operations around the world, in places where, even if we're tired of counterinsurgency, tired of stabilization missions, we may need to do them whether we like it or not, typically as part of coalitions, but still in a difficult, demanding, prolonged way. I can imagine scenarios where we stay in Afghanistan with 10 or 20,000 US troops until 2020. I can imagine scenarios where we wind up, like it or not, in Syria with a NATO Arab League coalition trying to defend the innocent civilians that President Assad is slaughtering right now in increasing number. I could imagine a mission in Yemen for a somewhat similar purpose. So the basic notion that we can somehow dismiss the possibility of difficult counterinsurgency operations because we're all a little tired of it right now and it's no longer the flavor of the month in national security debates is a trend we have to be nervous about and careful about. So I'm not suggesting that we just jump on the bandwagon and declare the era of land warfare over. I'm talking about a more marginal shift. So even if we go from 2 land wars to 1 land war at a time, we need to do several additional things. And I'm ticking them off to quickly finish and then look forward to your questions. 1, we have to have the simultaneous capability for these smaller missions that I've just mentioned. That would typically be part of coalitions, typically be more in the spirit of stabilization operations, not major ground wars per se. But we better assume that they could occur. And in fact, I favor what I call a 1+2 framework for sizing the ground forces. 1 all-out war, 2 prolonged multinational stabilization missions. I admit it's somewhat arbitrary to say 2 as opposed to 1 or 3, but nonetheless, based on recent history, it seems a prudent basis for force planning, and I think that each one of these stabilization missions could involve several American brigades over a very extended period of time. And we've all learned the hard way. Many of you have learned the hard way or had to maybe deal with the fact the rest of us didn't anticipate well enough that these missions in places like Iraq and Afghanistan take a long time to finish once they get going. And we need a total force capability to handle several brigades of deployment for a long time, while we're also capable of handling that one big war, for example, on the Korean Peninsula. So caveat number one, condition number one, be ready for other missions. Condition number two, you better be able to ramp up fast. If one war begins, an all-out war, you've got to start to ramp up the rest of your force right away. You don't wait and hope for the best. You start to ramp up your capability so that no other would-be aggressor around the world sees an opportunity at that moment. And what that means is you mobilize part of the National Guard's combat brigade capability. Other aspects of the reserve component might be quickly mobilized, really on a preventive, prophylactic basis, not because there's any other acute concern at the moment, but because you want to send a message. And then you also start increasing the size of the active Army and Marine Corps at that moment. But if you do those things, and here's where I'll finish, I actually think we can go to a somewhat smaller active Army and Marine Corps than the Obama administration is currently intending. As you know, they're saying we could go to 480,000 soldiers, 182,000 Marines. I think these numbers are, at one level, reasonable, but they're a little bit too high for what I thought necessary to meet the budget targets, and they're higher than I think we really need to be if we make proper use of the reserve component, while recognizing that more of our threats have shifted to the maritime domain, to the littoral areas of the Persian Gulf and the Western Pacific, not quite as much to the sands of Mesopotamia, because for better or worse, however Iraq now develops in the future, Iraq and other major countries in the Middle East are unlikely to drag us into large ground wars. So I think that by making greater use, frankly, of the institutions that you represent and have served within and embody and can tell us so much about, I think we can actually make a little greater use of this asset in the way that Director Petraeus was discussing that we've learned how we can do in the last decade, and really shape a total force package with a little greater reliance on the reserve component than we have so far. I think the active Army could wind up at 450,000, the active Marine Corps could wind up at 160,000, and these would be reasonable numbers as long as we recognize the great asset that we have in all of you. I don't want to push the argument too far. We should not be pulling you out of your communities, and the existing reserve component should not be pulling people out of their communities, out of their lives frequently. We need to do this in a careful way. But I think looking at the full range of threats to the country, including the threat of the debt, that it makes sense to try to use the portfolio of active reserve in a way that favors the reserve component a little more than we have so far. With that, I'll look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Typically provocative.
Thank you.
Again, please, if you have questions, pass them into the center of the aisle. Our Sergeant at Arms will collect them, and Bob Feder will hand them up to me. I see a stack already building. I'll kick things off. This may be down in the weeds a little bit. You already picked on the Navy a little bit. Why do we need big deck carriers with 5,000 people and catapults and arresting gear when we're currently embarked on the most expensive defense acquisition program with the F-35? And the short takeoff and vertical landing capability of the F-35B is pretty close to the carrier and the Air Force variant. And those fit on small deck ships. Why do we need big carriers and carrier task groups?
That's a great question. I do think that over the long term, and I'm delighted to see so many young people here, and I think within your lifetime we will have fundamental debates about whether the large deck aircraft carrier is really the right thing to keep investing in. But in the short to medium term, I think it remains a formidable asset. It continues to be dominant vis-a-vis the kind of capabilities of adversaries that we see in the Persian Gulf and the Western Pacific. And by the way, if we wind up in operations in either of those two places, as you know, Allied land access is sometimes limited in terms of where we can operate F-35As or other land-based aircraft. In terms of the F-35B, which I admire as an aircraft, and I think we should purchase. I think the problem is that it's not so clear that you really have a greater cost efficiency operating off of an amphibious ship. An amphibious ship costs you, a big deck amphibious ship costs you a couple of $1 billion, and you can put a couple dozen aircraft on it. A flat deck, a big flat deck, has cost you in the past $6 billion. Now that number is growing with the next generation, and I'm not sure I'm persuaded the extra money is worth the cost. But in any event, it's roughly 3 times as many airplanes per ship, roughly 3 times the cost. So I'm not sure you really change the cost calculus that much by talking about F-35Bs on amphibious ships versus F-35Cs or FA-18EFs on traditional big carriers. Where I do think there are ways to save more, very briefly, is using the amphibious ships in the Mediterranean. I don't think we need to have our larger deck ships doing much in the Mediterranean anymore. The threats there are not great enough to warrant the capability brought by a big flat deck. They should focus on the Persian Gulf and the Western Pacific, which is why I'm in favor of going down from 11 to 10 in the number of flat decks of the traditional big variety that we have.
Great. You mentioned the ramp up of capabilities and the use of the reserve force for that ramp up and as a holding capability. What are the implications for the size, the training, and the equipping, and the laws that enable mobilization on the reserve force?
Well, I think there are a number of things we would have to do to make sure that we don't overuse the reserve component by way of force planning. But I think in terms of the legal and policy framework, we've learned a lot in the last 10 years. I think most of what we need to figure out how to do, we've figured it out. You figured it out, frankly. And you've actually dealt with the difficulty. The real challenge here is the human cost, the human transition of figuring out how do you make life in the civilian sector compatible with being part of the reserve component. And I know there have been titanic shifts, huge shifts, in how the reserve component thinks about service and how you recruit, how you have to talk to would-be recruits. I think the hard part's done. I mean, I think you guys have done it. And yes, there are some ongoing legal issues that have to be addressed. But frankly, if you have a big war that begins, you're going to have some kind of a congressional resolution, ideally, to authorize that war. And that resolution simply needs to repeat some of the legal language that we've now developed over the last decade to deal with the legal issues. The hard part, again, is the human side, and that's up to you. You've shown us how to do it. We've tried to learn those lessons. I think we're capable of doing that again if we need to.
To pile on that a bit, in the coming budget cuts, should our cuts to incentive programs and benefits like health care and retirement for the reserve force on the table?
I think the answer has to be yes. And in fact, I've been gratified to see many people in the military acknowledging that the answer needs to be yes. I think you need to have an important voice in this. I think we need to find a balance between asking, how do we maintain our sacred vow as a nation with an all-volunteer military, and even in cases where some of you were not necessarily volunteers when you joined, you still risked your lives on behalf of the nation. And we owe you a huge debt of gratitude and a huge obligation. But I would begin with some of the same premises that seem to guide Secretary Panetta. We have to make changes gradually. We have to make sure we don't cut across the board in all benefits. We have to think hard about people who have been affected by the wars the most, the wounded warriors, their families, their survivors, make sure we're fair to them. But I also think it's time for a bit of a reallocation of more of the benefits towards the younger military personnel who do 1 or 2 tours and are out, and for whom most of these benefits have not been accruing. And frankly, I think we can save some money, do better by the younger generation and the shorter termers, and still do it in a gradual enough way that it does not disproportionately and adversely affect people who have been counting on these benefits. One last word on this. Even though I'm in favor of rethinking military pensions, military health care, TRICARE for life, et cetera, it is a little troubling to me that we're getting this whole locomotive going full steam while we haven't yet found a way to talk about broader Social Security reform and Medicare and Medicaid reform in the nation writ large. In other words, if we're still... we need to ask everyone for collective sacrifice, and it doesn't really make sense to focus on the entitlement benefits and the retiree benefits of those who have served at a time when it's politically untouchable to focus on the other 90% who haven't served.
South America, Central America have not been center on the defense establishment's radar scope over time, but we have it as the nexus of narco-terrorism. We have a continent-wide populism movement that is changing the governments. Hugo Chavez is rumored to be on the last years of his life. What do you see as the implications of this hemisphere in our national defense?
Boy, it's a great question.
And Homeland Security and immigration.
It all comes together. It all comes together. Yeah, I think an answer needs to touch on all of that. I'm going to have to be brief, though, and not as comprehensive as I should be. But I think I would begin by saying there's a lot of great stuff going on in Latin America that we need to be grateful for at the same moment that we're troubled by the violence and the drug wars. And we've seen an incredible wave of democratization in Latin America. In fact, in many ways, you could say it was the main precursor, along with what happened in Eastern Europe, to the Arab revolutions or awakenings that we're seeing unfold right now. The number of Latin American countries that went democratic essentially in the 1980s and early 90s is astounding. And it's essentially now a democratic hemisphere, North and South America. This is, I think, on balance, extremely good news. We've also seen a couple of the democracies, like Colombia, really get on the ball and figure out how to use their democratic process to find leaders who can make a meaningful difference in their violence, and in a violence that affects us too. We've also seen, I think President Obama, one of his more significant accomplishments has been to ignore Chavez, and he tried, you recall he tried in those first few months to say hello to him at that one OAS meeting, and it was a little uncomfortable, and some people thought he smiled too much, and some people thought he smiled not enough, but he shook the guy's hand, and he hasn't really spoken about him since. And I think that's the perfect way to handle Chavez, who, as you say, in one way or another, is on the way out. And I just don't see him gaining any popularity in the region. He has a message that's broken. His country, tragically, is not doing well. It has one of the highest violence rates in the entire hemisphere, even though it has some of the greatest oil resources. He's a failed leader. He's going to fade away. On that issue, I'm not as worried about him. But we still have big problems in Mexico. And Mexico has a political system that's functioning okay in some ways. I mean, they're having vigorous democratic debates. And they did some things with their overall approach towards the drug war under their current leadership that in many ways mimic what General Petraeus did in Iraq and Afghanistan. But unfortunately, they haven't managed to turn the corner. And I think we all have to be very analytical in how we think about what's needed next. The Mexicans are going to make the decision, but one thing we have to think about in this country is what can we do to help the Mexicans by way of reasonable gun control measures. And I'm not talking about taking guns out of the hands of law-abiding Americans. I'm talking about tracking the sales of semi-automatic weapons much more effectively than we do today, because those weapons account for about 80% of the violence in Mexico. And we owe our southern neighbor a little bit of a debt of obligation to think hard about what next steps may aid, at least modestly, in their problems.
The one country that has not yet been mentioned in the first 2 hours of this symposium is perhaps our most apparent threat and adversary and potential nuclear power, and that's Iran. How does Iran figure into your calculus of our national security?
Well, it figures in initially in the sense that I don't believe we can talk too much about a pivoting or a rebalancing to East Asia. And the administration, of course, I think has done a good job reminding East Asian allies that we are there, and we're committed. We're not going to cut. Actually, I have some doubts about the current Okinawa plan, but we can talk about that some other day. But in broad terms, it's certainly correct that we should not be cutting our overall capabilities in the Western Pacific. But at the same time, you can't push that argument too far, because whether you want to get out of the Middle East or not, it drags you back. It always does. And there are times when we get involved in wars of choice, but for the most part, the world still has a dependency on the Middle East in terms of oil and gas, in terms of stopping nuclear nonproliferation. And that's why, in my argument in the Wounded Giant book, and what I've tried to underscore today, I think we have to view the Persian Gulf, as well as the broader Middle East, and the Western Pacific as equally important theaters of future military focus. There are a lot of ways we could talk about the specifics of where the crisis with Iran may go in the next few months. I'll leave that to other speakers and other sessions of the symposium, realizing we don't have much time right now. But I think as a matter of defense planning, we cannot and must not understate the centrality of the Persian Gulf. So the rebalancing to Asia has been good up to a point, because it reminded countries in that region, including China, that we are still very much a Pacific power, that this region is as important as any other to our future national security, and that this region has a lot positive going on for it right now that makes it important to stay involved. But the Middle East, while it has some positive things too, has problems like Iran that make it impossible to ignore, and it has to be an equally important locus of future American defense planning as the Western Pacific in the coming decade.
Dr. Hanlon, thank you very much for these provocative looks at the defense establishment. We have a couple of gifts for you. One is our coin.
Thank you very much.
And a thank you gift that we hope you use as you go forward and do the great thinking of the Brookings Institution and continue to be our conscience.